Today's gaming industry is a cutthroat business, with many gaming companies relying on the success of their next game to keep afloat. When the stakes are this high, publishers tend to generate massive hype before the game is even released, and sometimes they start writing checks which they can't cash. Ultimately, when the game hits the market, it turns out to be nothing more than big talk. Here are some titles which prove to be more bark, no bite stuff. First up, Duke Nukem Forever. After Duke Nukem 3D hit the market, it felt like everything the gamers could wish for. So, quite naturally, when they announced the next installment of the game, it made a lot more than a few heads turn. The stage was set, the crowd was cheering on, but then the glitches started to show. First off, there was quite some delay before the game finally hit the market, so much so that it became a reference for a game which was coming. When the game was finally released, you'd expect that if it took a whopping 15 years to finally develop a game, it'd be some out-of-the-world thing. But instead, we got Duke Nukem Forever, pun intended. The game was heavily criticized by everyone for a score of issues. First off, for a shooting game, it had an awful lot of time when Duke was just running around doing everything except shooting. Even when he gets handed a gun and starts to shoot, the controls were just clunky and awful. There were many issues with the shooting accuracy, and the melee attacks seemed to connect very seldom. The overall experience turned out to be mediocre, even by a decade-old standards, and don't get us started on the loading times. In a nutshell, the game had an outdated design and graphics which left a lot more to be desired. There were some characters which weren't animated, and others which required massive tweaks in theirs. Speaking of the storyline, it looked like the game was just trying to follow the ongoing trends instead of creating something new. Ultimately, the game was not the out-of-the-world thing it hyped us up to believe, and turned out to be a disappointment, one which took 15 years to materialize. Next up, Assassin's Creed Unity. Assassin's Creed Unity had high hopes associated with it ever since it was announced, but that's the case with every other installment in the Assassin's Creed franchise. So what's different? Unity was to be based on the French Revolution, a new era, stunning country and landscapes to explore, and new figures to assassinate. Moreover, it had the legacy of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, hands down the most successful and amazing game in the Assassin's Creed lineup. Yet, when the game was finally released, it had a tough time right from the launch. It was loaded with numerous bugs and glitches that made the experience a nightmare. Although Ubisoft fixed most of these in later updates, the people knew the roller coaster was headed downwards. Another thing which came as a big shock was the storyline. Story used to be the one area that the Assassin's Creed franchise would always deliver on, not for Unity sadly. The game's main assassin, Arno, had a weak story, so much so that the player never really feels that special association with the character. Moreover, his motivation throughout the game turns out to be nothing more than the conventional revenge tale. The story also seems to make the iconic Assassins vs Templars theme seem forgettable. As for the graphics, the game deserves an applause for the stunning recreation of 18th century Paris. But that's about it, for while the city landscapes made you feel like you might be actually in Paris, the repeating filler characters in the marketplaces would land you back in your chair. Oh, and lest we forget it, the game came with a second screen app requirement to access the unlockables. In short, the bar was set too high, a lot was promised, and the reality of it proved to be just another sham. Moving on to our next disappointment, Shenmue 3. Shenmue 3 promised to deliver the nostalgic experience of Shenmue and Shenmue 2 with improved and top-notch graphics. Not only that, fans craved the immersive storyline, expecting that maybe they will finally get to see how the story of Ryo ends. Yet the game, even after getting released 18 years after its predecessor, didn't live up to its hype. First, and probably the biggest disappointment associated with Shenmue 3 had to do with its storyline. People waited for almost 2 decades just to see Ryo's story progress and finally end. But the third installment ends yet again at a cliffhanger. It ends rather prematurely and feels like it's being dragged out. It's a recipe for disaster not to give the people one thing that they desperately want from a game. Another thing which proved to be extremely frustrating was the inability to skip through dialogues. Sure, nobody grew tired of listening to important conversations, yet not being able to skip the routine conversations with ordinary people proved to be a downer. Moving on, Cyberpunk 2077. A constant dose of hype pushed for 7 straight years made Cyberpunk 2077 feel like it would be the next revolution for video games. Everyone had high hopes, especially because of the people behind it, the creators of The Witcher, and the involvement of Keanu Reeves. Yet, the game failed to live up to much of its anticipation. The graphics were all stellar, but the game had too many bugs and crashed a lot on consoles. You'd be all immersed in the action and suddenly suddenly it crashed. Apparently, the content was too much for the consoles of those days to handle. The storyline also came out to be just drop-down shallow, with no depth. It didn't have any convincing elements that made the presence of an evil, exploitive corporation really felt apart from the surface-level gimmicks. One of the things Cyberpunk 2077 promised was the advanced non-player characters, or NPCs. Yet, what the game delivered was nothing short of a laughingstock routine by everyday characters. The thing stands out, especially with the cops, who on one hand would magically appear anytime you commit a crime, and literally forget about you as soon as you drive off a few blocks. In short, it left a lot to be desired. And now we have Homefront. One thing that adds to the beauty of gaming is that you can create speculative fiction and play around what-if scenarios about the real world. When Homefront was announced, it received massive attention, for its story was set to be about the North Korean invasion of the United States. Smoky, right? Needless to say, fans were in anticipation of the thriller, yet the actual game ended up leaving a bad taste for a score of reasons. The most notable failure of the game turned out to be the storyline. It lacks basic development since there are no notable heroes and the villains stay behind the curtain. The campaign was too short-lived, leaving many unsatisfied. The game's protagonist, Ethan Brady, is seldom heard from and nothing implies about his personality. Another disappointment came in the form of stealth mechanics, which proved to be very inconsistent. On one hand, if you were concealed behind a wall, the enemy soldier would sniff you out from nothing. On the other hand, if you killed an enemy with a loud gunshot, nobody around the corner would seem to have heard the noise. How unnatural is that? Last but not the least, Lair. Despite the $25 million budget and full weight of Sony behind it, Lair proved to be another title which talked big and delivered small. Maybe Lair set the bar too high for itself due to its stunning graphics and visuals, but the gameplay failed to finish close to its visuals by a mile, to say the least. You just couldn't get lost in the spectacular and polished looking world of Lair with that unplayable experience of 6-axis controls. One of the most annoying things about the control mechanism was the inability to pick your target. The computer chose who and what you'd attack. That's insane. Then why do I have the controller, right? Plus, the gameplay became excruciatingly painful whenever the fight sequence involved even a little bit of precision. The attacks wouldn't just connect, and so on. Another exhausting thing with the mechanism regarding a more prevalent attack was the unresponsiveness to register whenever you'd shake your controller to the left or right. It took a lot of time to register the action and do what you'd want it to do. So, in a nutshell, the game came with flashy looks and no doubt a very polished world, yet the actual play turned out to be a punch a hole through a wall experience. That's a wrap for this video. Which of these games disappointed you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.